So I want to briefly start here by looking at a dashboard. This one here is showing us a bit of an overview of our vendor risk management program. So we can see along the top, we have some high-level numbers that are showing us the total number of vendors, how many tiering assessments we're sending out. We'll sometimes refer to those as IRQs or inherent risk questionnaires. Those are really geared towards folks who are internal to the organization, who can help us understand the potential impact and criticality of a given vendor. Once that tiering assessment has been completed, we come up with this classification. We're able to see the different tiers for our vendors, and we can see we have 11 here that have been deemed critical. In this example, that is the highest tier that a vendor can be categorized. We can see the number of open risk assessments, those assessments that are past due from a tiering perspective, and those that are having what we're calling a tier recommended risk assessment. So we'll show you the tiering assessment here in just a moment, but based on those responses, based on the score that's automatically calculated, we can in turn determine which assessment we would like to send to our vendors. So Brian kind of took us through that high-level concept of operations earlier, and it started with onboarding. And there are a number of different ways we can get that information into ServiceNow. If you have a procurement system that has that information already, we can look to integrate and pull that information directly into ServiceNow. The other approach is to provide forms to the end users to go and initiate this process. So what we're looking at here is a portal that we've built for end users specifically to give them a one-stop shop for all things GRC or IRM. Along the bottom, we have the different requests that the business can make to initiate the vendor onboarding process. So the first one here is to request that a new vendor be onboarded. The second is to do new business with an existing vendor. And then the third is potentially we want to use a particular product in a new or different way. So we may have originally purchased the software to keep track of the cafeteria menu, but now we want to make sure that we can use it to store critical information for one reason or another. Well, we want to make sure that we capture that and are reassessing it appropriately. These forms can be built to gather as little or as much information as you need. This one here is just asking for some high-level information, including who is the vendor, their industry, what type of vendor they are, and these are pick fields, so they're not asked to just enter free-form text. And then folks internal to the organization who will be acting as the vendor manager and the business owner. So can ask for as little or as much information, but ultimately we want to understand who is this vendor so that we can start our assessment process. Once the business has provided that information and we've validated that this is indeed a new vendor, we can then start that tiering assessment process. So I've set one here just to show you what this looks like, and this is kind of an example of that tiering process. The business who's been identified to help facilitate the gathering of this information would get an email notification, and they'd be able to come into that same portal to answer these questions. So in our example, we're asking for questions around what's the relationship that we have with this particular vendor. Are they strategic? Are they providing us a competitive or operational advantage? And this is where we start to understand who this vendor is and how critical they are, which helps us better plan for resiliency needs. So I'll go ahead and quickly answer these questions. And on the next page, we start to ask about the interaction that we'll have with this vendor. So, what sort of data will they store, process, or transmit? Are they going to have access to anything we would consider intellectual property? And these all, again, help us understand what level of due diligence we need to be performing on this particular vendor. And then the last one here is impact on compliance and risk management. And one of those areas where that kind of facilitated joint conversation between the business and the vendor team may be required because this may not be something that the business knows offhand. Ultimately, based on these responses, we're able to calculate out what we think the tier should be. It's worth mentioning that what we've looked at, that kind of initial portal, is something that we've built for clients in the past, just to give them that one-stop function. But everything we've looked at so far can be accomplished kind of using some of the standard options. Once we've received those responses, we're here looking at the internal view. So this is what our vendor risk management team would see once that tiering assessment had been completed. Just to orient you quickly to the form along the top in the chevrons is the high-level process that this tiering assessment has gone through. We were previously in this awaiting response prior to submitting those answers, and now we're in this tiering assignment stage. The intent is that Sarah Green, member of the vendor risk management team, would come in here and review the responses provided by our business owner. And she can do that by going and viewing the assessment down below. Ultimately, based on the responses provided by the business, this has come back as a critical tier vendor, and that is kind of the highest level that we have for our program. Sarah can see whether overriding that is necessary, and a lot of times when override is permitted, we would require justification as to why Sarah took that action. Ultimately, Sarah reads this through and determines that this is proper classification for our Acme Incorporated vendor, and she closes out this assessment. What happens when we close out a tiering assessment is it takes that information and updates our vendor record. We've built, leveraging the native functionality, the business rules that say when a new vendor has been classified as a critical tier, go and send the predefined assessment. That includes some questionnaires as well as some document requests. So we can have that logic already assigned, and we can see here through the different pop-ups that assessment has been sent to Acme Incorporated. Ultimately, at this point is where we get to Acme logging in and starting to take the assessment. If I switch over here to the green window, we are now looking at the vendor assessment portal. And I've logged in as Alex Newson from Acme Incorporated. And so this is what it would look like from his point of view. In the top here, we can see the vendor record, so Acme Incorporated. And below, we can see all of the different engagements. These engagements are how we start to tackle when a particular vendor initially provides us very low risk services or products, and then in the future wants to become a critical supplier. We can assess each of these engagements separately, both from a tiering perspective, as well as the assessments that we send for the vendor to complete. This is a great example if you're using kind of that reseller, as we had earlier in our discussion, where you would want to keep track of the different assessments that need to be performed depending on the product or service you would want to purchase. The really nice thing, one of the many nice things I should say about the vendor portal is they can self-manage their access. So you need contact information for one individual to start the assessment process, but once that person has been identified, they can come in and manage their team. So they can invite additional individuals, and when those folks are invited, they get an email letting them know that they've been invited to participate in the vendor assessment process, provides them a default temporary password. So there's no need to have them onboarded into Active Directory, and this is kind of a self-managed way for vendors to get access to participate in the assessment process.
Yeah, we can take that was one of the questions that just came up to make sure we address that. So thank you for covering that. So I think just want to drive that point home. That does not require them to have an AD account, on your environment. This is, it's really just, simple as saying, here's a vendor contact and their email, and that they're able to then, not only provision themselves, but also add additional folks, additional contacts who need to go collaborate on the questionnaire and the document requests.
That's right. And while we have Alex here designated as the primary contact for the vendor at large, Alex can then designate individuals to those different engagements. So if there are different folks who need to respond to those assessments, who need to be the primary contact, they can be set up so that Alex isn't the only one who is responsible for responding to these assessments. So let's you delegate that work as well. All right. Well, ultimately, what we're here to show you is how to perform these assessments and what this looks like from the vendor's perspective. We have that auto-generated assessment because of the tier change. And when we look at this, we have a total of 4 different requests. We have 2 questionnaires and 2 document requests that we would like to be completed. So we have got a sample questionnaire, but a lot of times there are supplemental questions that need to be developed. So if they're providing any types of services that have a privacy impact, well, probably have supplemental questions that we need to ask because they're going above and beyond typical services that are rendered. And then we would a lot of times use a standardized assessment like the SIG to go and gather kind of traditional information technology risk information. The nice thing is if you do elect to use the SIG template, this is pre-configured templates that are available through the solution. As new versions are released, they're made available to you. And if a vendor has previously completed that assessment in kind of the standardized Excel sheet, they can import that into ServiceNow and it'll parse out all of their responses to all the different questions, really increasing the response time for vendors based on this standardized questionnaire. So a lot of value to be had on both your side and on the vendor side if you elect to do so. Ultimately, they would work through, they would complete this, and they would submit it back to us. Their ability to go through and perform review and approval cycles and say, was the question you answered correct? Do I think that you need to provide more information here? Maybe I reviewed a document and I didn't find that it was satisfactory. Well, all that back and forth and review can occur directly in the solution as well. So really intended to take all of this into the solution and not something that lives in emails or in phone calls or separate meetings. I've gone ahead and submitted this. And when we do, it'll let the vendor know when we expect to hear back. So we've got this set up where we're expecting a 1-week turnaround on the internal side based on reviewing those responses. And then you could go in, perform your review, and you can return these individually. And you don't have to return all 4 at once if there's any particular issues. Speaking of issues, we can do issues management. I've got a few that have been assigned here. So we can create and assign issues to the vendor. They can then assign it to different members of their team. These issues can be set up to send automatically. So if they answer particular red flag questions incorrectly, like we're not encrypting PII, well, that's always going to have an issue. Or if we send out a supplemental questionnaire about something like SolarWinds or the COVID-19 pandemic and they answer key questions incorrectly, we can have those issues created automatically. Ultimately, this allows the vendor to come in, see what the issue is. They can provide any type of supplemental information through attachments, and you can have a back and forth conversation with the vendor right here in the system. Knowing we have just a few moments left here in our demo portion, I do want to touch on those supplemental questionnaires. They are intended to be something that you as the vendor risk management team can create without having to go back to your platform teams. There's a questionnaire template designer, which I've got up here for a SolarWinds impact assessment. We asked kind of 4 simple questions when that occurred, but you can come in and drag and drop additional questions and even set up dependent logic. So I have a new question here that I may only want to ask when they said they were breached. Well, I've got follow-on questions if you say you were breached. So this is something that can be set up and managed by the vendor teams and then sent out to those different vendor contacts as necessary. Ultimately, going back to reporting, we can build out supplemental reporting and dashboards based on those responses. So here's one that we had previously built for kind of the start of the pandemic, where we were keeping track of whether there were related bankruptcy risks or operational risks or potential delivery risks with these vendors based on how they were faring with the pandemic. And so there's the ability to have very targeted reporting for these different scenarios when necessary.